Hello everyone, welcome to another video in this full stack Flutter development series. We are still looking at creating our restaurant backend, and in this video we'll continue by creating our restaurant repository and also our restaurant router, and to finally tie up everything together and to test it using Postman. So let us jump right into it. Now I'm just gonna go here, and inside my restaurant module here, I am going to create another folder, and I'm gonna call it entry point. And here I'll have my router and my controllers or controller. So I'm gonna go ahead and create my restaurant controller, Typescript. And then I'll export default class restaurant controller. Now this controller will use as its dependencies inside of the constructor the restaurant repository. So here I'll make this a private read-only variable, and I'll say the repository, which is of type I, restaurant repository. So now we have our dependency set up. We can go ahead and create those methods on our controller that will be called from the router, and then those calls also will be directed to the appropriate method on the repository. So I'll create that FindAll restaurant method, and because these are asynchronous calls, I'll flag them as async. And this function and all of our methods inside of our controller will accept as parameters express requests and also express response objects. So we have our requests and we have our response. So now we need to import express. So if we go ahead and say import all as express from express, so we get access to the response and the request object. And here what I'm going to do is also go ahead and create the router. So I'm gonna say restaurant router, and this is responsible for creating those express routes that will call the instantiate those controllers and call the appropriate method. So again, export default class restaurant router, and this class is in a sense a static class that has a group of static methods, or one static method that will configure all the routes for the restaurants APIs. So we have one static method configure, and in order to configure this router, I'll have as dependencies a repository, which is the restaurant repository, and also the token validator, which will be used to validate the JSON Web Token that will be passed inside of the HTTP header to see if this request is a valid request. And this method will return a express router. Again, let us import express. Here we have our express ready. So now we're gonna create a router or express router instance. And then we're going to say let our controller equal to our restaurant controller. So restaurant controller, and there will pass in the repository. So now we have our controller ready. We need now to set up our routes on this router. So the first route will be that initial root route. In this case, I'm going to use a get and say get root. And whenever we get the root here from this restaurant router, what I want it to do is to return the list of restaurants. So in this case, I'm going to call the chain of methods, pass in the request, the response, and the next. So now I'm calling a middleware here, and this middleware is the token validator, and this will validate the request to say whether or not this is a valid request or the token that is passed is valid. And after I've validated that, if it's a valid token, then I can go ahead and call the appropriate method on the controller. So request response, call the controller, the FindAll method, and pass in those request and response objects. And then I'll return my router. So that's the basic setup for the router. Now with just one route for our restaurants to get all our restaurants. Now I also want to have tests for this router. So I'm going to go inside test inside of restaurant. Here I'm going to create another folder, entry point, and inside entry point, that's where I'm going to do my test. Restaurant router spec. This is where my test will be done for my router. So I'm going to set up my test quickly. Restaurant here I want a bunch of dependencies that I'm going to quickly set up. So I've gone ahead and configure my test with all its dependencies. So as you can see here for my router test, which is more of an integration test, I'll set up my repository. I'll also create an Express application. I'll configure my MongoDB client also. And I'll keep a reference to my restaurant documents that will be fetched from Mongo. So here in my before block or hook or callback, I am instantiating the Mongoose client, and then I am connecting to that client using my testDB connection string. And from there, I am creating my repository and injecting that client. And I'm also creating a fake token service and a fake token store. Both of these, which are two classes that I've created here inside the test file itself. So the fake token service, which implements the iToken service, and the fake token store, which implements the iToken store. So I'm using both of those here, since we'll need them to configure everything. Then I am creating a new Express application or instantiating the Express application. I am setting up a few middleware here that it should use Express.json, use URL encoded. And then here is where I configure my restaurant route. So here I am saying use restaurants as the route path, and to that I will append everything else inside of my router, which will be returned here from my restaurant router and configure method, which accepts the repository and also a token validator, which accepts the token service and the token store, which in this case are both fakes. So now we have our test. And I'm saying before each, I am preparing the DB using this prepare DB helper method that we have created already. And after I'm cleaning up the DB, and then after each, and then after all the tests, then I'm going to disconnect from the database. So we have everything set up for tests. Now we can go ahead and write our tests. So for my first test, I am saying I wanted to return 200 and a list of restaurants whenever I make a request to this path here, which is restaurants, the page, and the limit as query parameters. And I am setting the authorization token here. So I'm expecting a 200 response status, and I am expecting the request to have the metadata and also the list of restaurants. Now, if I run this, they should not work, since inside of my controller, I have not written anything. So that should fail. So now if we should go ahead and implement this method inside of the controller. I've gone ahead and implement that method. And now looking at this method, we can see where we wrap everything inside of a try-catch block. And the first line, I am getting the parameters from the request object or the query object. So inside of my router spec, this is the query parameters, and I'm getting that from the request object, and I am using JavaScript destructuring to get those values out. And after that, I am just making a call to the repository find method and passing in those values. So I'm changing it to integer since it comes over as string. So I'm passing in the limit, and then I'm passing in the page. And then here I am handling the promise. which is a pageable. And then when the promise is successful, that means it hits the database, comes back with appropriate data. I am setting the response, the status on the response object to 200, and also set the JSON content to what was returned from the repository. In this case, I'm setting the metadata to what's inside our pageable object, which is the page size, and the total pages. And then I'm also setting the restaurants to the pageable data. And in this case, that would be the list of restaurants. And here I am catching the error. So if there was an error with fetching information from the DB, then I will catch that error here, I will set it as a 404 status, and I will return the error. And otherwise, if the try fails altogether, I'll return a 400 and return that error to the user. So this is our FindAll method, and will basically be the blueprint for all the methods inside of our controller. So if we should go ahead now and run our test again, then we are expecting that it should pass. So now we have our test passing. So that first route is working as expected and is getting all the data that we need, the restaurants data from the database. So I'm just going to go ahead again and implement another method on the controller, this time the FindOne method. So for our FindOne method, again, it's basically the same structure as before, where we fetch the necessary parameter from the request object. In this case, I'm not using the query object, I'm using params. Then make a call to the repository, to the appropriate method, in this case FindOne, passing in that restaurant ID. And then from there, handle the promise that is returned. In this case, it will return a restaurant, though I am setting the response to a 200, and I'm setting the JSON to that restaurant object. And if there's an error, I'll catch the error and return that error also. So it's pretty similar to the method above. Now inside of our router, we need to go ahead and create a route for this to that method. So I'm just going to copy this, and here for this route, I want it to be at this path, restaurant, and then ID as the parameter. So again, it will validate the token, but now instead of calling the FindAll, I'll call the FindOne method. So that's the route to this method, as simple as that. If we go back to our spec, we can go ahead and write our spec for the FindOne method. So here is our spec, our tests for the FindOne method. Pretty simple. I'll get the restaurant ID from those saved restaurants, and I'll make a call, a GET request to that route or path, restaurants which is the base / restaurant ID, which is what I have created here. And the ID property will get the ID of the restaurant that I am looking for here. I'll set the authorization token, and I'm saying I expect a 200, and I expect that the response body must not be empty, and that the response body name, in this case the restaurant name, should be restaurant name, which is a hard-coded value in our fake data that we are passing, or we are inserting into the database and retrieving. So if we go ahead and run that, in this case we have a failing test, and so we need to figure out what's the cause of that. And if we go to our router, as you can see, we have our path, name incorrect. So it should be restaurant. If we go back to our spec, restaurant, go ahead and run that again. And as you can see, we have a failing test because of some spell error. Expected restaurant to equal to restaurant. So there is some spelling error inside of the helper method that writes the information to the database. So I'm just gonna go ahead and flip this one around also. Give it the incorrect spelling. It's not the best thing, but you guys can go ahead and correct it in your code. Run that again. So now we have our test working as it should. So that's it for find one method. We will go ahead and create the other methods inside of the controller. So here we have our FindByLocation method. Again, pretty similar as the others. I am again extracting all the information from the query object here. In this case, the page, the limit, the coordinates, longitude and latitude. And I'm extracting all of that from the request query object. Then I go ahead and create a new location object using those coordinates. And from there, I call the appropriate method on the repository. So now I call the FindByLocation and I pass in the appropriate values, the location, the page, and the limit. Then I am handling the promise here, which again is a pageable object. And then I am setting the JSON to the appropriate, with the appropriate values, in this case, the metadata and the restaurants that have been retrieved based on that particular location. Then I'm setting error if there's an error, and if there's an error within this try catch block altogether. So we have that, our FindByLocation method, and again we go to our router and basically copy and paste and set and configure this route. So I'm just gonna call this route location, and then I'll call the FindByLocation method. And now we can go ahead and write the spec for that method. The spec here is pretty similar to all the others before. It's a GET request, but it's just how we set up the URL now so that the query parameters will have all the values that we are expecting here. So inside of our query parameters, we are expecting a page, a limit, a longitude, and a latitude, and all of that will be passed inside the URL over to our API. We set the token, then we have our expectation. Metadata not empty, restaurants not empty. So if we go ahead and run that, there we have this one passing also. So we continue the process with the other two methods. I'm just gonna quickly create those methods and again explain what is happening, which is pretty similar. So that you guys have seen the pattern so far. So the other two methods that I've gone ahead and create is the search and the get menus. And again, we extract all the necessary parameters from the request query object. Then we call the appropriate method on the repository, passing in those variables that we extracted from the query object. Then we handle the promise which is a pageable in this case, since it returns pages of data. And we set the method data inside the JSON to the data that we retrieve from the pageable object, and the restaurants, the list of restaurants in the pageable object. And we have our catch to return the error, and also our catch for the try to return the error. So this catch is for the promise in case there's an error calling out to the repository method, and this one is for this try catch block. Similar thing, you get the menus, we get the restaurant ID from the request parameter. Then we call the appropriate method on the repository, passing in that ID. Then we get our list of restaurants handling this promise here. We go ahead and set the response status to 200 and the JSON object to the list of menus. And there we return error here and error here. So those are the two remaining methods here on our controller. And we can now go ahead inside of our router and create routes to call those two methods. So we have our search route, and which again, all these do the same thing. We validate the token that is passed over from the authorization header and call the appropriate method on the controller. So we have our search, and then we have restaurant, the path is restaurant menu, and then the ID of that restaurant. Then we call the appropriate method. So inside of our spec, we can go ahead and write those tests. So we have this spec for our search. In this case, we call the necessary API endpoint here, and we pass in the necessary query objects. Name as the query, limit, page. Then we call out and retrieve the data. Same thing here. Get the restaurant ID from the list of saved restaurants, and we pass in that ID here as a part of the endpoint or token, and we reached out to the necessary functions, methods on the repository. So if we should go ahead and run those tests, this one is passing. Go ahead, run this one. This one is also passing. So now we have all our routes, and we have our router configured, and we have our restaurant controller here working as it should. So we can go ahead now in the composition route and tie all of this together. So now inside of our composition route, we simply create another method that configures the router. So here we have our RestaurantRoute, which creates a restaurant repository, inject the Mongoose client, which is we already have here, and then we create our token service, in this case using the actual JSON Web Token service and not a fake token service. Then we have our token store, which is our Redis token store, and we pass in our Redis client, which is already here. And then we have our validator, token validator, which accepts both those as dependencies. Then we simply configure our restaurant router. Now the only thing left is to go inside of our app and to say app use game restaurant, let me get the name correct, and then we call our composition route and call the RestaurantRoute method. And there we have tied everything together. So now we can go ahead and test this in Postman. But in order to test this in Postman, we actually need to have some information configured in our Mongo database. So what we're going to do is that inside of our environmental variable, inside of our env here, we need to create another env that I'm going to call devdb instead of testdb, and I'm going to use the devdb here instead of the testdb for my Postman requests. Now I'll need to inject some fake data into that Mongo database that I'll be creating soon, and in order to do that, I will need to set up some kind of script that run and push fake data into that dev database. And I already have a script here that I will add, and you can fetch it from the GitHub repository. So here is the script. I've gone ahead inside my test folder, inside of the restaurant, inside of helpers, and create a file named fake data. And I've gone ahead and set up a bunch of functions that will push fake data to your MongoDB dev database. As you can see, it is using that string known as devdb, but you also need to install faker because that's what's generating the fake data. So you'll need to say npm install faker. So we use that to generate fake data. You'll also need to install the types. So go ahead, add types faker, since we are using Typescript. There we have our faker types installed and our script ready. As I said before, I'm not going to explain the script. You can find it on the GitHub repository and you can use it. I'll show you how to use it shortly. But first, we must go to our MongoDB client and create this dev instance. So inside of our Mongo Cloud, here inside of the Mongo Cloud Atlas, what we need to do is to go ahead and create a database, create an additional database. In this instance, you're going to name that database dev instead of test. You're going to name that database dev, and as you can see, I've already created that database here and added those items. But I'm just gonna go ahead and remove all of them. So now I have only my app test DB. So if I say create DB, enter the name of the database. In my case, it's food app dev, and a collection. I'm just gonna use the users collection. Go ahead, create that. And now we have our DevDB set up here inside of our Cloud Atlas. So now if I quickly move this, and here inside of our env where we create that dev env, the password is the same, everything else is the same. The only difference is the name of the database. So go ahead and change the name of the database. In this case, my database is, instead of this, it is dev. So now to populate our database with the fake data, I am going to go to the terminal. I'm going to find the path to this file, Control-Shift-P, and you can say, or Command-Shift-P if you're using the Mac, you can say copy path to active file. Then I'm going to say npx run and paste the path to that file. You go ahead and run that. There are some errors. I think I am running the wrong command. Let me get that correct. So the correct command is npx tsnode and then the path to the file. So if you go ahead and run that, then that should run this file and populate your dev database. So now if since I've already run it, if I should go ahead and look inside of my database, you can see where it has populated those collections. So let me go ahead and refresh this. So you see it has created those collections and populated them. So we have our restaurants here. So now if I should start the server, npm run dev, inside of Postman, you will first have to sign in so that you can get a token, because if you do not, or sign up, since there's no user currently inside of that brand new database. But you would have to sign up, get yourself a token, and then after you have signed up and got that token, you would go ahead and execute restaurants to get the list of restaurants, and then you would set the here inside of headers, you would set the key to be authorization, and you would paste that token value here. Now this token should have expired, so if I run this now, then it should throw some errors. Host 3000 restaurants. Port 3000. So this is not finding the path, and I think there might be some incorrect values here. So if I should check, as you can see, I have restaurant here instead of restaurants as the root. So now again, if I go ahead and run this, still getting error, not found. Let me diagnose that. Well, of course, the server needs to be restarted in order for the change to be reflected. So let us go ahead, restart server. So now if I make a call to that endpoint, then you can see it will throw an invalid token since this token that I have has expired. And this is based on the expiration date that I've set in the JSON Web Token service, which I think is like 1 hour. But you can go ahead and change that to some long timestamp so that the token won't expire so easily. But that's it for this video, guys. You can go ahead and test out the rest of the endpoints, and if there are no issues, you can join the Discord channel and there we can discuss it. But that's it for this video and for our restaurant module as far as the API is concerned. The next video we'll go back to our Flutter app and to tie everything together. So thank you for watching, and remember the code is on GitHub. You can get it there. See you in the next one.